So look, I'm just going to, it's probably important, I thought, to place this presentation about older women and homelessness in some context. I think it does require a little bit of an understanding of all types of homelessness in Australia. So we've got some context and some of the causes and the solutions. And of course I'll be speaking mainly about the Older Women's Homelessness Research Report and its conclusions and recommendations, and I'd like to pose some possible solutions. So there's 105,000 people who are homeless in Australia. I do always recommend not to start a presentation with that figure because it's so incredibly overwhelming and it seems we can never solve that. I always invite people to think about each community. Certainly that's 105,000 Australia-wide, and compared to some other countries, not too bad, but it's still not okay that that many people are without care and without housing and without all the benefits that housing bring, and Ben's just spoken about that. We need to think about homelessness in each of our communities, and certainly when we talk about the inner city of Sydney, that might be, you know, perhaps up to 1,000 people. In some smaller country towns, you know, it might be 5 people. In smaller regional cities, it might be 50 people. And they're the kinds of solutions that we need to think about, collaborate on, and come up with some local solutions. So I always say, think nationally and act locally. It does need these local solutions to be backed up by good national policy, and I'm going to, I guess, speak about that towards the end and the fact that that apparently seems to not be happening at the moment. So just so you know, the people included in the homelessness count in Australia, which is done by the ABS at every census, include those who are sleeping rough, and in fact they represent 6% of the total number of people who are homeless, people staying in homelessness services, and people who are in inappropriate or substandard accommodation. So, having said that, when you think about homelessness, is this what you see? And in fact, these are the 6%. I'm not actually suggesting we ignore the 6%, and I'll talk about that in a tick because it's something quite close to my heart and to the work of the Mercy Foundation. But when we think about homelessness, this is not generally who's homeless. This is people just like you and I, people having housing crisis, people losing job, losing housing. And Australia has a relatively satisfactory safety net in that most people who experience homelessness only experience it briefly, and fortunately, or unfortunately, around about 20%, we think, of people who experience homelessness may be experiencing it multiple episodes or long-term, or as we say, chronic homelessness. And that certainly is a problem that needs to be solved, and that's why I briefly divert to this slide, because I guess even though I am talking to you about older women's homelessness today and the research that was undertaken, we actually mustn't forget that smaller group of people who do continue to be homeless year after year. It has multiple health problems for people. We have some pretty significant evidence showing that people who are chronically homeless and sleep rough are at much greater risk of death compared to other people in the community. They're at much greater risk of having violence, having trauma, etc. And so I guess in thinking about all the other types of homelessness, we mustn't forget some of the most vulnerable citizens in our country, and that's a relatively small number. I actually firmly believe it can be solved with permanent supportive housing. Certainly housing is the answer to all homelessness, but some people need ongoing support. And I guess this is the other side to what we're talking about today in care. We're talking about people that have a major care deficit. They actually don't have, on the whole, anyone to actually care for them, anyone to advocate for them. And when you've got multiple problems on top of that, and in fact we know around about a third of chronic rough sleepers have a brain injury, so we're not just talking about something that's acute and affects people from time to time. We're talking about neurological damage that makes it difficult to actually organise yourself, organise your life, and people definitely need additional care. So that was a brief diversion. I am going to talk to you about the work that was done by Dr. Marie Peterson from the University of Queensland, commissioned by the Mercy Foundation. We particularly wanted to understand some of the issues around older women who are experiencing a housing crisis or homelessness. We not only wanted to understand what was going on, we particularly wanted to try and understand what could be some of the solutions, hence the focus on pathways out of homelessness. There's often a lot of discussion in the homelessness sector around what causes homelessness and what their problems are, but I think that focusing on solutions is an important thing. So we launched that report on the 14th of April. And it got a bit of an attention, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So as well as outlining the pathways out of homelessness, Dr. Peterson also looked at the current situation in order to get some context, and I think Ben's already nicely, I guess, shown some background as to why this could be happening. He's shown the home ownership rates are going down and the expense of private rental and the lack of private rental. Women actually represent just 36% of older people who are counted as homeless. So in fact, older men still experience homelessness more than older women. The important thing here is that the trend, though, is upwards. And it's upwards quite significantly. So even though we're still talking about relatively small numbers, we're definitely talking about a trend that is a troubling trend. I would also add, even though I know the ABS does try to do a great job in counting people who are homeless, it's a difficult job. It's a difficult group to actually count, and I think women, and perhaps older women who have seen a lot of life and been around, and as we've already heard, are better at keeping, sustaining connections, are possibly better at hiding as well, often hiding, maybe not deliberately, but staying with family, moving between family members, etc. They're not necessarily quite as visible as homeless men. So what Dr. Peterson found was that homelessness in the older women's group, and by older women she's used 55 and over, those that have had a longer history of homelessness, so those that I've just spoken about who absolutely need solutions to their problems, those who have had some kind of crises, intermittent crises throughout their life as far as not having stable housing, and those who have led, in her words, more conventional lives and have had absolutely no prior history of housing crisis, and they were the much larger group. So as I said, those that have experienced homelessness for longer periods certainly shouldn't be forgotten, and we do need to have more permanent supportive housing and approaches to housing and support for those people that need that kind of support. So, as for conventional women, we're talking about those that Ben just spoke about, those who have spent a lot of their life caring for children and other family members, and they may not have ever been. I certainly remember my mother and father got married in 1953, and my mother had been studying nursing, and she immediately had to, well, it was actually a rule, you couldn't continue to work once you got married. So there are plenty of women in that particular age group who actually have not been in the paid workforce or in and out of the paid workforce, and as a result have very little superannuation, especially the current demographic. I know that super only came in after I'd been working for about 5 years. So we've got situations where perhaps women may have jointly owned a house, but they might have also had a lifetime of renting with a partner, especially those that had not been able to get a foot in the door with housing. Even though the policies were around supporting that, there were certainly people who were still in private rental, and I don't need to tell you how difficult it is to sustain private rental in any of the capital cities on a single pension. So what we're talking about essentially is older women in poverty. I took that from the Age article that discussed this piece of research about a month ago, because it was such a great graphic, and that actually shows the affordable one-bedroom rental lettings in Melbourne for the last 13 years. And as you can see, they've gone down significantly. So add women living in poverty and lack of affordable private rental housing. And I guess it's no surprise to anyone that we've got a problem. Last year I took some examples. I sat down with a calculator and looked at the median rentals for some suburbs, some major suburbs in Sydney, and looked at what percentage of the minimum wage you would need, what percentage of the pension, or what percentage of New Start that you would need in order to be able to rent at that median rental rate in some of those suburbs. And as you can see, every single one of them, if we consider 30% of income is affordable, every single one of them is unaffordable. However, I guess you could kind of probably get by the 50% ones, but when you look at some places where it's 103% of the pension or 138% of the pension, needless to say, we've got an affordable housing crisis. I guess there's some other issues that were raised in the research, and this is around concern that older women, well, anyone really, but certainly older women who may not necessarily have anyone caring for them, they may be on their own, asking for the kinds of modifications that you may require as you get older if you're in private rental. That's just a basic thing. I think about my own parents. My mother now cares for my father who has dementia, and they've had to make, quite a lot of changes, modifications to the home to make it easy to be able to manage him, and you can't even begin to do that in private rental. So the loss of the partner in actually being able to cover rent is a possibility, and of course we've got older women who are able to somewhat stay hidden through couch surfing amongst family members or amongst friends, etc. But we mustn't forget in doing that there's significant shame associated with that, significant embarrassment associated with that. And I might add, that's for anyone who experiences homelessness. Everyone feels that shame. We mustn't forget that homelessness means that you're kind of asking for charity. The paradigm that we have at the moment as to how you solve homelessness is about asking services for things. And it can be an incredibly embarrassing and shameful experience. And we know that it can be incredibly traumatising as well. In fact, there's some evidence to show that some of the mental health conditions that go in tandem with homelessness can occur after someone becomes homeless because it is so very traumatising. And needless to say, greater difficulty finding work as you get older, and it's going to be even older now at 70. Some of the conclusions, and I think this first one is a really important one, there's actually a lack of attention to this issue. So there was actually very little that Dr. Peterson was able to find that looked at older women's homelessness. I know that there was a good study a few years ago here in Sydney by Ludo McFerrin that looked at the issue, but as far as the academic research, there was very little that had been looked at older women and homelessness or housing crises. So also finding that there is a need to engage homelessness housing services with the aged sector. We do work in isolation. In fact, not only does the homelessness sector not necessarily work all that wonderfully with the aged sector, it doesn't actually work all that wonderfully with the housing sector. And they're the two sectors that you would think would need to work hand in hand. It's not a criticism, it's just the way things happen. We get involved in our particular issue, and there's a particular way in which homelessness services have historically been provided, and they haven't necessarily involved having great links with permanent housing. So there's a need for affordable housing for the majority. Some people may need support, and we know that some people, as they get older, may need some additional support, but not necessarily. So I don't think there are any great surprises in that research. I think it was great that the issue was highlighted, but the fact that women who had led conventional lives are experiencing higher rates of homelessness is certainly something that we saw anecdotally, but I guess we have a little bit more proof of it now. And I think that this also speaks to the way in which we think about homelessness in our community. I have seen over the past couple of decades an increasing wanting to pathologise anyone who becomes homeless. Oh, there must be something wrong with them, they're homeless. And a complete denial of the system in which we are functioning, a system that Ben spoke about, a system that needs some systemic change. You know, it is about poverty and affordable housing, and it is about poverty and affordable housing for most people who become homeless, even though there may be some people that need some added support services. Often it's caseworkers that are provided and not housing. And that's not a criticism of caseworkers, it's just that a caseworker doesn't equal a house. And in some ways, this is something that often doesn't get discussed either. There's a bit of over-servicing of some people. I mean, I'm not sure if we all need a caseworker if we become homeless. We do need a house though. So it's a little condescending to suggest, and I guess I'm not, this is a slightly flippant slide. I'm not suggesting that every older woman who experiences homelessness is offers a living skills course. I think that a lot of services are terribly sensitive to ensuring that they do offer the correct type of services. But a living skills course doesn't equal a house either. And why on earth would a woman who has looked after her family for the past, 40-odd years need to do one? We absolutely need to make sure that housing is front and centre of the solution to homelessness. And I know this sounds terribly obvious, but it is often not part of the discussion. And so I think that we have, as a nation, quite carelessly redefined homelessness as a problem of the individual. And it's not. It's a systemic issue, and I'm so pleased Ben showed those slides and showed exactly how systemic that issue was as far as the policy pointers that are making sure that that some of the housing, I mean, I know now it's probably easier to actually buy a second house than it is to buy a first house, and that, I don't know, that just doesn't seem right. So, housing ends homelessness, and it actually ends homelessness for everyone. Those who need support obviously need some kind of permanent supportive housing, and we absolutely don't have enough of that. People who are ageing, getting older, need to be in a place that's able to have modifications and help come in if that's what's needed later on. So, basic answer is affordable housing. Not exactly sure how we can achieve that overnight, but we absolutely need to advocate for it, and we absolutely need to do some work on that. It's not about charities. It's not about a charitable response. It's actually about a systemic response. I also find it a little bit interesting and that the media at the time that we launched this report got really, really interested in this idea that middle-class conventional women were experiencing higher rates of homelessness. That's all they wanted to talk about. And that's great. Absolutely need attention on that issue. I don't have a problem with that. However, it almost said to me that, hang on, do we think that there's a group that deserves to be homeless and there's a group that really doesn't deserve to be homeless? No one deserves to be homeless, especially in a country as wealthy and fortunate as Australia. There's a story that I actually took directly from the Age article in April that just really gives you an example of someone who was living in private rented accommodation, didn't have proper hot water, it was really difficult, and obviously a lot too anxious to ask the landlord to fix it lest the rent go up. And in fact, I'm not sure if you're reading through it, in fact that's precisely what did happen. And that person was, in fact, made homeless. She'd spent her life working as a nursing aide, and we know that the aged care sector, which is dominated by women, is one of the most poorly paid sectors in Australia. And Joan's homelessness was actually solved with affordable housing. She didn't need anything else. Perfectly capable woman of meeting, all she needs to do to meet her life needs. She may, as she gets older, because she's in her early 70s, require some additional help, but certainly all that she needed at that moment in time was affordable housing, and she was able to get that through a community housing provider in Victoria. So what's next? I'm not suggesting the Mercy Foundation can even begin to solve this problem on its own, but I do know that housing certainly coming up with housing solutions to homelessness is one of the issues, the most significant issues that requires the most amount of collaboration. When you think about homelessness and you think about individual responses to homelessness, I can't give someone a house. I'd love to. I can't. We can't. We can give them a sandwich. We can give them a blanket. But homelessness and housing response needs the most amount of collaboration because it is an issue that we cannot tackle individually. It does, in fact, need us to come together with some solid solutions that are actually going to solve the problem and not endlessly service the problem. So we've pulled together some representatives including from COTA, but the aged sector, the women's sector, homelessness and housing sector, to look and see if we might do a few projects to see if they might work around addressing some of these issues. One of which might be, I think the idea was originally floated in Ludo McFerrin's work around the secondary suites idea from Canada. I think that the New South Wales government has put a SEP in place to assist that to happen, but I do think that we need to have a go at that because I think an older person rattling around in a house who may want to separate that house into two dwellings so that someone else can be housed, it's a nifty way of getting some extra housing, but look, I wouldn't pretend with the local government development rules and all that that's a really easy task to do. I think that we might have to put together some help for people who might want to do that because there's some significant housing assets out there that could perhaps be shared in a different way. So that's just one example of a project. I'd be interested if anyone wanted to talk to me about other ideas. So, as I said, if you want to have a look at the full research, it's on our website. I have a summary handout that is available today, and I'll put it on the desk out the front. And that's it for me.